Christina Hoff Sommers, welcome to Dad Saves America.
Oh, it's wonderful to be here.
So I read your book, The War Against Boys, about, I want to say, 5 years ago. And it played a big role, frankly, in the creation of this show, because you were capturing something that I was experiencing through my son, and not even necessarily, well, actually, it was first through his experience at his school, and it led me to change schools for him.
Uh-huh.
And then as time has progressed, your other books, One Nation Under Therapy and Who Stole Feminism, they feel so relevant. And so that's why I'm so excited to have you on the show. I want to kick off with a question that I don't have good answers to, and I have a feeling you're going to have pretty interesting thoughts about. So that is,
Okay.
what, in your view, is femininity?
What is femininity?
Yes.
Well, I think you have to be careful because it's not to say that there is only one way to be feminine or to be female. That it is long understood that it's a complex collection of traits. Now, overall, we might associate femininity culturally with being more nurturing, caring. It's also associated with, the hyper feminine girls or guys might like a certain kind of aesthetic that's more, it's sort of a attraction to, uh, appearance and the certain way of dressing and makeup and so forth. Self-presentation, and then it's contrasted with masculinity. You see, it's more associated with um, assertiveness and you think of males less in the nurturing and more in the protecting and defending. That was the convention. Now we had two major, waves of feminism to overthrow a rigid categorization that to be feminine, you must be this way. You must be, all involved with care and nurture, and to be masculine, you must play the role of protector, defender, because there were people that just didn't fit into those categories, and it was very oppressive, stultifying to have to conform. Um, However, I think I would say there are still many women who enjoy conventional femininity, who are naturally drawn to a role of nurturer, caregiver, caring, and as well as the other aspect, more aesthetic side of femininity. There still are many women and there are men that embody the masculine role. And I think that we want a society that is permissive of everyone, those who embody the conventions as well as those who rebel against them.
Okay, I'll keep this quick. Be sure to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so that you won't miss more Dad Saves America as our videos come out each week. And it also really helps us because when we reach out to guests, they look at how many subscribers there are to decide if they want to come on and share their ideas. So please subscribe to the channel. It really helps us out, and thanks for watching. Now, back to the show. We are living in times, particularly as parents, but I think as all people, where navigating these ideas has gotten really difficult. And I say that as somebody that doesn't have, I went into the creative arts. I love aesthetics. So I like to talk. I'm social. So there's a lot of aspects of sort of the conventional feminine that I see in myself and that I love. I have a
Right.
super tough masculine dad, but we're Italian, so we all cry. So the thing that's happening around gender in our society, and I want to get to the transgender thing hopefully in this conversation at some point, but the conversation around how to navigate gender and how it's presenting in our pop culture, it's more difficult now than ever in my lifetime. And how do you think about where we are right now as someone who came up through as a feminist and who has spent her life, your life, writing about gendered issues and about things that affect boys, things about girls, and feminism writ large? Like, where are we right now, in your view?
Well, I think right now we're just very confused and uncomfortable with the whole topic. Because if you look at parents raising boys and girls, now again, to go back to what I said before about conventional masculinity, femininity, the typical little boy has a different play pattern from a little girl. For example, experts that study playground dynamics, what they find is that boys are typically drawn to rough and tumble play. There's a lot of mock fighting and sound effects and just running around. Girls do it too, but on average, the typical little girl prefers theatrical play, turn-taking games. You are very likely to see two little girls in the playground, best friends sharing secrets. You just don't see that with boys as much. And these differences, as hard as parents and teachers and others have tried, children don't seem to want to be liberated from these traits. And it's very, very hard. You will war with children if you try to do it. They've tried it in Sweden, in special schools where they wanted to eliminate gender. And all they were doing was policing the kids. It just turned into a school where the kids had to be constantly monitored because the boys would, they would have tomato sticks, for the garden, to grow tomato vines. And the boys would turn them into swords and want to fight. And they would try to get the children to play constructively with dolls. And again, there was one classroom where the girls were playing with the dolls and the boys had the baby carriage and catapulted the toy doll from the roof, that sort of thing. It is the characteristic play of children cross-culturally. We do not know of a culture that is different, and it even is known to happen in other species. The species closest to us, chimpanzees and gorillas and so forth, have similar play patterns. So I would say those are universal traits. But again, there are going to be kids that aren't like that. There are going to be girls that were tomboys or boys that just were not interested at all in rough and tumble play. But here's what worries me is right now, teachers and parents are very unhappy with the way boys play. And stipulate, have had two sons. It can be unnerving. But I'm worried that little boys exist in an environment of constant disapproval because the teachers they prefer the theatrical, imaginative games of girls. As was once a girl, I prefer that kind of play. But the average little boy doesn't behave that way. And so you have schools that don't allow any, no running and just the kids are kept inside, increasingly not allowed any kind of raucous play outdoors. And they've pulled back on recess. Now, it's not good for girls not to have recess. All kids need it, but it's really bad for little boys. And I think some of this is, you see that we even try to medicate little boys. I'm not against using Ritalin for kids who genuinely have ADHD and attention deficit disorder, but I think most even psychologists would agree it's overprescribed. So to your original question, where are we today? I think that we've lost touch with reality. We have a nature. There's something human nature. And there are, as I said, the typical ways of being. And most people grow up and conform to them in one way or another and are reasonably happy. But as an evolved society, I have to always say that we have to make a place for people that are the exception and encourage kids. I'm not against encouraging little boys to play imaginative theatrical games or exchange confidences with a best friend, but that's just not how most of them are.
Your book, The War Against Boys, lays out a case, focuses on across the culture, but spends a good amount of time talking about the ways in which school, as it's constructed on average, is really just designed for girls and harms boys, is not aligned. You're already saying some of the ways in which boys on average are not going to be comfortable sitting in class and being forced to just sit and listen to someone lecture at them for 45 minutes and be audible processors instead of physical ones. But lay that out, and what has changed? What if anything has changed since you published the book in terms of your view of school? Has it gotten better for boys? Has it actually just gotten that much worse? What is the current state of school for boys?
Well, since the first edition of the War on Boys came, I would say things have gotten worse for boys because no one is paying attention. Even though by every metric, you can see that young men are faltering academically. They are far less likely to get good grades, less likely to go to college. And if you look at any measure of failure and just, you know, the boys are the ones that are getting most of the failing grades. They're much more likely to be suspended or drop out and so forth. And this is all happening at a time where education has never been more important to a child's prospects. And right now we're doing far better job educating girls than boys. And this is true across all, class and ethnic racial lines. The girls are doing better than the boys. And when I looked at the classrooms and saw increasing intolerance, I mentioned before, for just the way little boys like to play, not making much room for it, cutting back on research, cutting back on, unrestricted play and so forth. Kids are increasingly monitored. This is harder for little boys. And even the topics in the classroom, um, there have been good studies in what little boys like to read. There's a lot of books with action, or a book about a monster devouring a city, um, or books about things. And girls like fiction and poetry more. But increasingly, the reading list is tailored to the interests of girls. And this is through, there are wonderful stories. There are lists of books for boys that boys find irresistible. And I know this because the British have a similar problem with male underperformance, and they've gone to great lengths to find ways, especially to connect young men to the written word. Big challenge. Partly because girls, on average, have better verbal skills, and they like school better. They're more engaged. They're more connected, and it's harder to teach boys. So why don't we have a special pedagogy in our schools of education for helping boys learn, helping them, for identifying their talents and so forth? We're not doing that, and so many boys just don't have a future in education. And I said at a time where it's never been more important.
Why is that? Why would an enterprise called this degree in education systematically ignore 50% of the population in its study and its efforts to understand how to do its job?
Very good question, and I think it is not an exaggeration to say that our schools of education have been carried away with sort of eccentric theories about the oppression of girls. And for years, uh, there have been sort of best-selling books, not a lot of serious scholarship, but a lot of popular books about how the system is failing little girls. And most of that is built on stories or anecdotes. If you look at the real data, these girls, uh, are much more, as I said, doing much better in school and are proceeding ahead. They're a year and a half ahead on average, of the boy sitting next to them in writing, and um, a year ahead in reading. And so if you looked at that, you would think, all right, what are we going to do for the boys? But the schools of ed have become so political that they are more likely to warn teachers that boys are the inheritor of a patriarchal system, and this young man has, had all the privileges, and now it's time to turn the table and give more attention to girls. Well, whatever the privileges are in the society, we can debate men and women, but these are children. And a little boy in the classroom is not more privileged than his sister. I mean, the whole thing is preposterous. But yet, if they teach anything about gender in a school of ed, it would be that girls are being shortchanged by the system. Years ago, I believed that, but then I looked for the evidence and couldn't find it, and found things I discussed before. All the measures, and if you look at grades, if you look who were the valedictorians, if you go to any high school graduation, who won the honors, it's girls, girls, girls. And it seems to be getting worse. So if you look at even the ambition, we have the Department of Education has data about what does a child see for themselves, and do they want to be a professional? Do they want to go to college, graduate school, and so forth? Much higher percentage of girls have these ambitions. And that changed. It wasn't that way in the 50s and 60s and 70s. It started changing in the 80s and 90s. And now it's, as we mentioned before, and someone once said, it looks as if our schools are run increasingly by women for girls.
That that was one other striking thing that you pointed out, that prior to that I hadn't thought about in a systematic way, which is that especially K through 12 and elementary school, it's overwhelmingly going to be women at the front of the classroom. So why is that important? Why is it important, and it makes a difference that, I don't know if it's 8 out of 10 or 9 out of 10, but it's north of 7 out of 10 K through 12 teachers are female, and so the authority in the class is going to be a woman for the overwhelming majority of kids in a traditional K through 12 school. Like, why does that matter?
Right. So male teachers are just disappearing. Increasingly, it's a female environment. I even once had a superintendent of schools in the Detroit area call me and say that most of her teachers, she was talking about elementary school classrooms, but she said the classrooms are so girly and flowery, and she sort of wondered if boys feel like they don't really belong there. Couldn't she do something? And they were asking me about how they could change the classroom. But and I think any good teacher might have that instinct, but that's not something that will be supported in the literature. It won't be supported in the schools of education. That boys and girls might prefer, it might be better if you had some rocket ships, or I don't know, dangerous animals or spiders or something. But the classrooms, the content of what they read, even the way they write. There's one expert on child and how children learn to read and write and so forth, and he said that the model that in the classroom is that the model now is a confessional poet. So increasingly, kids are given the assignment to reach down inside themselves, and talk about what they felt and how and this would be torture for many boys. And I'll just tell a quick story. When this was years ago, when my son was a senior, his graduating class, high school, this was in the summer, they took a camping trip. And he really had a great time. But at one point, a visiting creative writing teacher came. And this was in the desert. And they said, okay, go out. And she told all the students in his class, go into the distance. And it was dusk. And here's a candle and some matches and pencil and a notebook. And discover yourselves. And as he described it, the girls cooperated and went out, wrote their deep feelings about the stark loneliness of the desert. I don't know. And the boys, completely bewildered by the assignment, kind of gathered in a circle over outside the teacher's view, threw all the notebooks into a pile, lit a match, and made a bonfire.
It's exactly what I was thinking it was going to be.
And I felt sorry for the creative writing teacher, but it was a summer school. And these were not bad kids. I mean, but they were just, what are they going to do? And I thought there were so many assignments you might give, but this, and I'm not saying aren't some boys that would flourish with, such an assignment, But as it happened, it the girls liked it and the boys didn't, and they were got in trouble for it. And the he said that one of the teachers was worried that they were like proto arsonists, or that this was toxic masculinity. Aha! So the teachers are look. They hear a lot about that, and they might think some innocent thing that boys just will do, um, that used to be understood, what might not readily be categorized as dangerous and not to be tolerated. So this is what I mean when I just say the classrooms have become a little oppressive. And I remember one wonderful man in Texas actually was looking at the dropout rates of Hispanic boys, because Hispanic girls are just flourishing in school, and now an Hispanic girl is more likely to go to college than a white boy. Um, and the question is, what do you do for the Hispanic boys? And he told me that he interviewed a boy, and he said, Hispanic boy, why did you leave school? He dropped out of high school, and the young man said, well, I just thought nobody wanted me there. And I just thought about that. Just the very how many kids are we losing because no one takes an interest, and they're not doing that well. They don't really understand what it is expected of them. There's just this aura of disapproval, and we can do better. And other societies and other countries, English-speaking countries, have the same problem with boys, and they're desperately looking for solutions. The British are constantly setting up commissions and doing reports and things of trying to address the problem of male underperformance. We do nothing. There's nothing. You look in vain in the Department of Education, in any school of education. I'm just not aware. There are many individuals who care a lot and are talking about it, and but you will not find, as far as I know, things can change. But so far, I am not aware of a school of education or even a department of education in any state or local government that's focused on the needs of boys. You can have programs for girls, but not for boys.
It's we've had Warren Farrell on the show and talked about with him the boy crisis, in which he lays out all the ways in which, I think it's like across more than 50 metrics, boys are not simply falling behind relative to girls, but they're falling behind in absolute terms from prior generations of boys.
Right.
And so it seems like there is a zero sum philosophy at play here, where in order for girls to succeed, they are climbing to the top of a mountain that only has so much space, and it's time for boys to fail. Do you think that that's a fair characterization of the ideology that's at play here?
I don't think that most teachers think, well, I don't care if boys fail. Now it's girls' turn to shine. But I do think there are that philosophy of that it's a zero-sum game, that there's a battle between, Venus and Mars, and we have to be on Team Venus. And um, I mean, a classroom, first of all, I think you have to cater to all sorts of temperaments and learning styles. And as I said in the beginning, there are kids who defy the stereotypes of their sex, and there are girls who were bonfire builders, and there are boys who were creative writers. So a teacher should pay attention to that, to sort of masculine, feminine in the conventional sense, and work both into the classroom. Have writing assignments and reading assignments that interest kids, just whatever their sort of area of interest and so forth may be. But I think we play very much to the more feminine side with the assignments. There was a friend of mine, Sandra Stotsky, who was an expert on content. She did content studies and social studies and literature. And she said she was looking at social studies texts in public schools and said you would think that the West was settled by teenage girls traveling with their parents, a teenage girl traveling with their parents. It's just sort of, they edited out military history. They edited out, tales, amazing stories that would interest anybody, but especially boys, about, you know, World War II and World War II triumphs and military adventures and so forth, edited out of the system.
The challenge as a father of a son is that we only have so much that we can do for them, but we put them into school, and then as they get older, they go out into the culture through media, through their friends, and they're just bombarded by messages. And I've done everything in my power to try to protect my son's belief in himself as someone that is good, as opposed to a problem. And that has often involved pulling him out of schools. Like, again, when I was reading your book, I had pulled him out of a school where he would routinely be told that boys are bad. Like, quite literally, to his, like, oh, the boys are a problem. That they would have guest speakers that would talk about toxic masculinity.
Right.
And there's a kind of like the guilt of the father is befallen on the son thing that seems to be going on. It's like, my son's
Well, yeah, think about it. So you have many boys, by the way, growing up without fathers, who then go to school, no male teachers. And you would think that the educational system would say, well, you know, boys need positive male role models. What better way than to have more male teachers? And there would be a national campaign to attract more men into teaching. And when we saw disparities in the sciences, massive efforts to get more women into sciences, and effective. I mean, many more girls and young women are going into the sciences. Why didn't we do that, or why don't we do that for young men to interest them in teaching? And then there's a further problem. Some boys have serious psychological problems. Not the majority. The majority of males are not mentally imbalanced, but some boys are. They need psychological or psychiatric help. Increasingly, the world of psychology is female. So if you need help and you go to a therapist and you're a little boy, you know, you're at home with a mother, there's no father. Often there are boys that grow up without a father, certainly don't see him very much. Then you're in a school, and then you're a psychologist as a woman. And these theories about male toxicity and having to overcome this patriarchal oppressive culture, these have penetrated the American Psychological Association, psychology programs. And so if you had to seek help for a little boy, not only do you have to be careful that your teacher, you have to make sure she likes boys, and typically it will be a she, and a psychologist would be the same. I would ask a lot of questions and make sure they're not captive to some angry theory about pathological masculinity. And by the way, there is such a thing as pathological masculinity. Tiny percentage of males are dangerously violent and predatory. But that's not normal masculinity. The normal man is quite the opposite. They don't prey on weaker people, they protect them. They don't tear down and destroy things, they build them. And so there's a positive model of masculinity, but I think increasingly we take the fairly rare cases, comparatively, of toxicity and make that the norm and take that out on little boys in the classroom, sometimes in the home, and now even in the psychologist's office.
How do you explain the fact that there seems to have been this tremendous lag that we're still living in, where the facts laid out in The Boy Crisis and in your work and writings about how boys have fallen behind, how college graduation rates are now 60-40 female to male, workforce participation, life expectancy, incarceration, overall
Suicide.
health, it's indisputable that boys are are heading in the wrong direction and have been for a long time. And yet, if you go into a classroom today, and if you hear like the various this month, that day, this day, girls STEM day. The whole culture and education system still seems to be acting as if girls are behind and need to be propped up and need to be encouraged and encouraged and encouraged, and that the system, the culture, it's still an uphill battle for girls. You hear this all the time, like, oh, it's so hard for girls. And that just doesn't seem to have any bearing to reality to me. So is there any truth in that? You know, obviously women face certain things that are very distinct, like the risk of sexual violence. That men don't worry about. I've learned this from my wife. She has said, like, you know, you don't have to worry about certain things when you go into a parking lot that I worry about. And I think that's like a thing that we all have to confront as men, that we don't even think about that. But walk me through your work about this gap between.
Well, I think that if you looked at the average male, female in the United States and looked at the deficits and benefits of of the sex, you know, what are the advantages to being a man? What are the disadvantages? It turns out that it's just a complicated mix of blessings and burdens. There are ways in which men are privileged and ways in which women are. And it's impossible to say who's better off at this point. And it also depends on the complex set of advantages and burdens, and it varies by social class and so forth. But it's absurd to simply say the women are so much worse off and the men are. I mean, I think it's a central fallacy in feminism. They fail to notice, well, let me put it this way. I think too much of the feminist movement focuses on men and women at the very top in professions, like how many CEOs of Fortune 500s. And it's true, there are far more men than women, and it would be, I would like to see more men who are, you know, senators and just at the top of their profession. But what happens when you look further down in society and people who are not, you know, in the top 10% in terms of education and elite degrees and so forth? It's a different picture. If you look at working class men and women, it's, you know, both have burdens and challenges. And one of the special burdens that a working class young man has is he's likely to be less educated. And he's entering an information economy where, as I keep saying, education has never been more important and literacy has never been more important. And we have a large cohort of young men coming along who are not going to find a place for themselves in this economy. And so the fact that we have a women's movement that has only looked and primarily focused on some imbalances at the very pinnacle of society and not looked at just the reality of the lives. And to be more specific, if you look at, they'll talk about the wage gap, and that's true. There's a gap and we want to close it, but I think we have to be honest about it. It's not as extreme as they say, and most of it's explained by the different jobs men and women do, or how many hours you work per week, things like that. But also men do most of the dangerous jobs. There's a huge gap in mortality in the workplace. Like, I don't know, something like 5,000 Americans die in the workplace every year. 94% of them are men. So that, you know, that's, and then it goes for, that's mortality. But also it's true for injuries. And I mean, men do most of the dangerous, gritty jobs, the jobs where you're outside or pitching tar or on top of roofs or construction. These are largely male undertakings, and that has to be factored in when you're doing this calculus of well-being. And but we don't do that. We just don't do it. And and that's, I'm still a feminist. I believe in equality, but that means you care about men and women. And you don't see, as you mentioned before, you don't see it as a competition where you have to be on one team. Because I think that also if men are in trouble or boys are in trouble, so are women. We're in this together. So what we're doing now is so perverse, because by not attending to the education of young men, there's going to be a mismatch. People typically marry someone with a similar education. What's going to happen? I mean, we know what's happening right now. A lot of people aren't finding each other. There's a lot of uh, loneliness. And I just don't think the solution is to focus on one sex and not the other.
I want to come back to the relationship issues, the gaps that are widening. But it's one of the things that it seems like is happening for girls that is maybe more exaggerated in our times right now is what Jonathan Haidt's been noting
Mm-hmm.
about the impacts of social media in particular, and that the anxiety, the self-harm, the general psychological profile for girls seems to be collapsing farther faster than boys in response to their screen time. How have you looked at this? How do you understand what's happening to boys and
Yes,
girls here?
at first I thought that Jonathan Haidt, whom I greatly respect, but at first I thought he was exaggerating and it wasn't that bad. But I'm convinced that something is amiss, and it does seem to correlate with the rise of s- this times girls spend on social media. And I'd be very worried as a parent. I mean, I think people are worried. I will say this. It's another reason that we should attend to gender differences, because there's these disparate impacts. So I think it's clear to me that as we pull back on recess, that had a very bad impact on boys. And schools have, by the way, cut back from a lot of parents think it was the way it was when they were kids, but it's not at all. Some schools don't have it at all. Um, but with girls, I would think social media, there may be a disparate impact. And Jonathan Haidt has shown evidence that there is, and uh, it's a reason to be aware. I mean, to attend to the differences and how it may affect kids. But I will say one thing. There's one of the reasons that teachers might give that they want boys to write about their feelings, and they want schools to be more feeling centered, is that they think this is necessary to combat the dangers of some unhinged masculinity or something. But there was a very interesting study by I think it was Amanda Rose at the time. She was at University of Pennsylvania, and she interviewed a huge group of adolescent boys and girls, and asked them how they felt if they had a terrible problem. How did they feel after they talked about it? Did talking about it, talking it through, make them feel better? And she asked this, 14, 15-year-old kids. And the girls said absolutely they felt better. They were so glad they could talk about it with their mom or their best friend. And the boys, with a huge disparity. The boys said first of all, they thought it was weird. And that was the main word that kept coming up, and a waste of time. And it didn't make them feel better. And we have a lot of evidence that this is a difference. So most people rush in and say, well, that's not good for the boys. But actually, what they found was that the boys were a little more stoical and could sort of compartmentalize and move on. And the girls were ruminators. When they had a problem, they wanted to talk about it, and they thought about it, and they ruminated. And these psychologists concluded that maybe girls would be better off if we encouraged a little more stoicism, rather than spending all our efforts to get the boys to be ruminators and constantly talking about how I felt and what it meant, and which most of them don't want to do. And any mother of a boy will or father might know about this. But what if it turns out that that's adaptive, and that what the boys are doing is may be helpful to them? And maybe we've, in this highly therapeutic society where we're so focused on people's emotional states and things, maybe girls have a tendency for that. Maybe we've exaggerated it, and now they have to cope with all of the highs and lows that can be brought on by this social media, and what people are saying about you, what's going on, all that. It may be just impossible. So it just may be unfortunate uh, that all of these things have come into play at once, and the sensitivity of girls, which we have encouraged, is helping, adding to the misery.
It strikes me that there's something kind of perverse at play with this focus on therapy and on talking about and ruminating on problems, partly because it seems to me like when you conjure up the feeling of something that was painful, you essentially re-injure yourself to some extent. To some extent, you relive the experience. And it seems like there's a feedback loop there that is not fundamentally healing, but is actually sort of a multi-layered traumatizing that goes on.
Everything is classified as traumatic that used to be just, well, first of all, if you think back to how children grew up in the previous generations, I mean, life was a lot harder. And I don't wish a hard life on my child. And I'm guilty of being a helicopter parent as much as anyone else. It's just, it's impossible not to. But on the other hand, I recognize that my parents were more aloof. They were too busy with life to, and challenges, uh, and 3 kids, and they were very young. And they, basically they just didn't pay that much attention to us until, you had to be home at 9 in the summer before dark, I mean. And I don't ever remember them calling up a teacher or anything. I didn't want them to have anything to do with my school. And now parents are so involved, and the child, I'm worried that they're really not learning basic skills of just how to deal with the challenge of life. If you talk to psychologists now, and they've had to increase their numbers at colleges, practically all the kids have a diagnosis, and they're coming for they can't solve the problem. If they don't like their roommate or something, they don't seem to have the skills to deal with adversity. And so that's something else and I think Abigail's book was a great reminder to parents that there might be a better way than treating everything as an occasion for examining your inner feelings. Sometimes it's better just to move on. And that goes against the ethos, but it may explain why boys are having a less difficult time with social media. They have another problem with social media. They have a problem with getting addicted with the video games, but even that's exaggerated. A lot of those boys I spent a lot of time with that literature looking at boys and their video games, and for years they tried to show, well, it's making them more violent. That's not been proved. The most violent games of all were, coming out of Japan, and they didn't have high crime rates and things. I mean, they haven't been able to find a correlation. But they said, well, it's wasting their time. But a lot of those boys are learning a lot of skills. They became very interested in the techniques and the tactics, and they became early adapters of all sorts of technology, and they're off, majoring in engineering, that sort of thing. So I'm not sure that that's as harmful as people think. But I do wonder if we haven't made girls more vulnerable by pushing this culture of always being this kind of confessional and feeling centered, and identifying everything as traumatic, and getting all excited about any adversity in her life, rather than teaching young women to be a little tougher.
One of the things that's hard to get my head around in this, and my wife and I have been exploring adoption, and you go through just an enormous amount of trauma-related exercises because kids that are coming from a hard place, as the people like to say, they're suffering from abandonment and things that are really are traumatic.
Right.
But like all of human history was kind of like a bloody mess, and we're still
I know.
here. Like we're still here. So every prior generation has managed to survive a world that was murderous and miserable relative to today, without a lot of therapy. And that doesn't even seem to get acknowledged in our current time. It's like, how did we get here? How did we get across the ocean in a boat watching our family
Oh, I
members
know.
die?
You go back you don't have to go back very far. And people didn't used to be. Now we're very, and for good reason, protective and solicitous of children and so forth. But you can overdo it, and I think it's almost as if we've induced neurosis in a whole generation of kids, where they were sort of taught that every little setback is a catastrophe. That's something that, if you went to cognitive behavioral therapists, they would try to fix your thinking, or a stoicist would tell you, that you have to discipline your emotions. And but it's almost as if we're pushing kids to catastrophize and to think that and be sort of paranoid, and take any little setback and treat it as a trauma, and use these labels from serious, like PTSD, which was associated with being
Combat
in
vets.
war and seeing people blown up next to you. So, and now it's used more casually for all sorts of things. So I think there's been this inflation of language, and we've just frightened kids and maybe burdened them with this idea that of this feeling-centered therapeutic culture. And maybe it doesn't work.
You uh, embrace being a feminist, but a feminist of a particular sort. Help me. I'm not steeped in all of the history of feminism, so school me on your feminist path. You know, and you've shared this story many times, but how did you, where did you start in your engagement with the idea of feminism? What does it mean to you? And where did you diverge from, the path of feminism as it's gone into where it is now?
Well, I'm a strong believer in old-fashioned equality feminism. The idea that women deserve the same opportunities and legal rights as men. And this is a tradition. The first wave of feminism grew out of the European Enlightenment and philosophers and thinkers of Mary Wollstonecraft and John Stuart Mill. And it led to revisions in the law, reforms of various kinds, changes in attitudes, until women were seen as fully capable, independent moral agents equal to a man. That's equality feminism. And it's been, to my eyes, a great American success story. I do think American women liberated themselves, with the help of many men, I would say. Many men. Equality feminism evolved in the United States, and when the real strides for and advancements for women came pretty early. I mean, in the women's movement, in the second wave of the women's movement in the 70s, with passing of laws and just getting rid of arbitrary barriers and rules that, a woman could be fired from a job if she was pregnant, and um, uh, you couldn't have elite academies where women weren't allowed. You had to open them up to women, that sort of thing. Couldn't have medical schools where women couldn't attend. Ridiculous. And we changed. There's another style of feminism which did not grow out of the European Enlightenment and in the classical liberal thinking. It's came out of Marxism and some of the radical theories that followed, and it views women as a class, an oppressed class, and thinks that nothing short of kind of revolutionary, completely overturning the society, will liberate women. And it's rather hostile to liberal feminism, the feminism I espouse. They don't like it. They say it's just a tinkering around and not addressing the deeper issues. Well, I don't agree with that. I don't think they've made that case. And however, that style of feminism, I call the feminism that I like equality feminism, but I call this gender feminism, because they believe there's a sex gender system and that we are all trapped inside this system. and that our destiny is decided. You know, you're a man, you're a woman, you're captive to this oppressive, relentless system that subjects women to every kind of misfortune. I think this theory is twisted, and it rests on a lot of false statistics that exaggerate women's vulnerability and completely ignore the vulnerabilities of men. I don't think they made the case. I think there's just a lot there that doesn't sustain logical analysis. However, they did not go through the process of logical analysis when they started women's studies departments. That rather radical theory just became the dominant ideology of women's studies and in most of the major feminist groups. So the moderate feminism that actually liberated women and could still liberate it and needs to liberate women around the globe who haven't had two major waves of feminism, that's kind of forgotten. And now we have this more strident movement that is suspicious and angry with men, to use them, you know, the world kind of, as you said, this kind of zero-sum game, and believes nothing short of some kind of total revolution where we overthrow all patriarchal systems. And that turns out to be everything. We've got to overthrow, the entire, tradition of my field, philosophy. They say, oh, well, it was mostly written by men. Well, that's true. And now that's going to change. And women, there are some great women philosophers. But historically, it's true that for complicated reasons, having to do with many societies, yes, being patriarchal, women did not have the education or the opportunity. But that doesn't mean you don't read the great philosophers, because I think young women today want to benefit from reading what the greatest thinkers, transcendently brilliant thinkers of human history, what they had to say. But in women's studies, you could often find they cultivate an attitude of contempt for the great writers and thinkers who happen to be men, because they are enthralled to this theory. So that theory, when they started talking this way and writing their books about patriarchal oppression, they weren't this was a tiny area in the university, and most people didn't even know about it because they were writing for their own journals. The leading journals and fields just didn't accept their papers. Of course, they thought that was patriarchal and so forth. And so this field developed, and it took over. And so this sort of radical feminist theory and intersectional feminism and so forth, all of that is now dominant in gender studies. And increasingly, it's taught in other departments. It used to be you would have people that had a degree in history. They learned the methodology of history, and they would study, women in history, but they would do it as traditional historians. Whereas a feminist historian would do it through the prism of sex gender theory, where they saw systemic, everything was oppression. They looked at it through the prism of this theory, but the theory was never tested except within this little insular community of like-minded people. However, a lot of liberal professors thought that they should have an intellectually diverse department, so they would hire people, or they would build a women's studies department. Those radicals did not feel the need to invite people in with different views. So feminism on the campus is a one-party system. Dissidents are not invited. If you are a moderate feminist, or you could even be an anti-feminist, you're not invited. They don't want to hear what you have to say, and you will be thought to be, just an apologist for the status quo. But they haven't proved they haven't made the case for their radical model that we have to tear down the patriarchy. As a liberal feminist, I think, no, we have to improve society. We have to look for places where there's unfairness or some kind of burdens placed on women unfairly. They can't succeed. But as a moderate feminist, I would think a big burden that's on women right now is the difficulty young people have in forming marriages and having families and having children. This has all become very difficult, but you wouldn't know it in a gender studies department because they're not looking at that problem. They're not looking at women's isolation and the childlessness for people who want children. That's a terrible thing. But if one of the things that's true is it becomes harder as you get older to have children. And for most people who have them, it's the greatest thing in their life. They're very, not for everyone, but for the majority, it's a source of meaning uh, and happiness in your life. But a lot of people aren't going to have that. And why can't that be a women's issue? You'll never find it on anybody's agenda. So I think it's too bad that gender studies ended up being a one-party system. But I think now it's moved out into the society. So the major women's groups, and now even in Hollywood movies and things, they all seem to be, this is what they think feminism is.
The thing that's so strange to me about this ideology that's taken shape and the way I mean, actually, the Hollywood movies are kind of a perfect example of the strangeness of this. It seems to be a vision of female empowerment that is to not embrace being female at all. Which and what I mean by that is the lazy Hollywood version is, oh, Superman, let's have Superwoman. But it's the same
Right.
story. It's the same kind of fighting. Oh, let's just do a race and gender swap. There was the South Park, put the character Cartman was playing Kathleen. I forget what name of the executive, and that's the Star Wars executive at Disney. And and it's basically making fun. Like, the only thing they're doing in the Star Wars now is like taking whoever the hero character is and saying, put a chick in it and make her lame and gay. That was the joke. But the joke stings because it is what television looks like now. There's a new Star Wars show out right now called The Acolyte, and that's the whole thing. Like, who's the most powerful force? It's a bunch of lesbian witches in space. That's the new Star Wars.
That's God.
Like, literally, that's a
I
description.
know. But you know what? I bet those young women, the majority of young women who go through college don't become angry gender feminists, but some do, especially the majors. And this is very strong. The more elite the university, the more likely they have a lot of very eccentric, sort of hardline gender warriors. And a fair number of young women, uh, again, not the majority, but maybe let's say 10%, 20%, believe this. And they want to carry that idea that, it's a battle and, they're on team Venus and we're going to win in this battle. And it's such a strange way to see the world. It's so wrong. But you mentioned at the beginning of this interview, I wrote Who Sold Feminism 94. I was researching it, in the late 80s. This is a long time ago. And I thought, well, I'll tell people these problems. And then wrote about the boys many years ago. And it's taking longer than I thought.
What's
It,
to it's so disheartening. The so the thing that is weird is to sort of complete where I was heading with the movies is that there's simultaneously a celebration of women from this gender feminism crowd in a kind of superficial sense, and yet a rejection of gender differences more profoundly. So it seems like you're both trying to erase the actual reality of women and then have a kind of like redrawn pencil sketch of a woman in its place that's like a new woman or something. I don't understand. I can't keep track. Do you love women or do you hate women? I can't tell.
I don't think they know because it's so deeply confused. And but it seems to be animated by this notion that we need to find a way, to liberate women from the sex gender system and from the heteropatriarchal system of sexuality. That's all I'm for liberating people from any system they don't want to be a part of. But what about people that will be happiest being part of it? Maybe want to be a part of it. I haven't seen any data that suggests that's not true. Over and over again, what you find is if you do surveys on and ask women, like, what is your ideal life? 20% want to be full-time, high octane careerists. 20% would like to be stay-at-home mothers, and 60%, these statisticians call them adaptives. They sort of want to go, when they have children, they would like to withdraw from the workplace and then work part-time and then maybe full-time later. They want to go in and out. So you've got 60%, well, actually 80%, who really don't want the full-time. They don't want to live just like the typical male with full-time job. Yet it's almost as if we've taken that model and that all the women's groups and the entire curriculum is to get girls to do that. And I didn't like the system where we're forcing girls who didn't want to be full-time moms or, wanted to be full-time careers. I didn't like not allowing that. But why are we working towards just reinforcing another set of stereotypes? And I think that's what's happened in Hollywood. It's happened in the curriculum. It's happening in elementary schools. People are confused. And I think if we could have I think we've really suffered from not having an intelligent discussions about gender. And so gender studies was a great opportunity to really talk about it and hear different points of view. But if you're a dissident, like my friend Camille Paglia, I don't know if you've read her, but
Yeah.
she's my favorite dissident feminist of all time. Everybody who's ever listened to her, and I urge anyone listening to just go look up Camille, Paglia. And she's a lesbian, scholar, feminist, an art historian. But she saw how the feminist movement was moving against beauty, especially female beauty, which she appreciated as a lesbian. But she was horrified just at the Puritanism and the hysteria and so forth that she saw in the movement. And she spoke out and very eloquently and amusingly. Her books are erudite and funny and full of allusions to pop culture and classical civilization and so forth. There were people like her and Katie Royfee and Kathy Young, and a lot of your libertarian young women scholars and so forth, who were pushing back, but we were never taken seriously. It never made any impact on a school of education. We were just I'm surprised there were so few. I wish there should have been more. Maybe there will be now, because things are changing and there are cycles. So maybe there'll be another generation that will rebel against all of this, and you'll have more young women sort of defending certain ways of being that they aspire to that don't correspond to the new models that we see in the movies and the books, and it's all sort of power feminism.
One of the things I saw you reference in some interviews and some pieces was this really strange concept to me. But I've encountered it elsewhere, and it is sort of in the Marx-inspired lineage, and that is the notion of a false consciousness that that you, by not buying into this whole oppression system that you've been describing, that what you really are suffering from actually is a false consciousness. You don't really understand why you're oppressed, and that's one of the ways that the sort of radical Marxian feminists just look at you. They're like, well, you're just delusional, or it's a very disempowering, condescending position. But how do you think about that? Am I characterizing that correctly?
Oh, absolutely. One of the problems you face if you are a gender feminist is the majority of women on the planet don't seem to be with the program. Because as I've said, most women do seem to enjoy conventional femininity and do aspire, as I said, 80% want something different from what maybe the now, National Organization for Women or some, the American Association of University Women, what they're pushing for. They don't seem to want it. So how do you explain that? And I don't completely discount the idea of false consciousness. I can imagine a society where women have no exposure to alternatives. They're not educated. They don't know. That's not American women. We're among the most informed and, educated women on the planet. I think that we know what the alternatives are. And it does seem very matronizing, if I can use that word, to tell women that they are victims and unwitting victims of a patriarchal system. Um, and I hear that because, I mean, for example, one reason that there is a wage gap, as I said, is that men tend to, who do stay in school and go to college and get a degree, they tend to get, if you look at the highest paying fields, engineering and computer science, far more men. And women, if you look at the lowest paying fields, it's like early childhood education um, and psychology. These fields don't pay as well, women. But do you want to say that the women, so they're going to earn less than a man? So by choosing to be an early childhood educator, you are choosing not to have the same income someone that's a petroleum engineer. Well, would you go to the young women and say that you're making the wrong choice? You have a false consciousness. I think they know that they could make more money if they went into something that was into finance or, some field in engineering that was more higher paying. And I think that it's ridiculous to say that young women today in college are, uh, writing their own, ticket to penury because of their choices. I think they have a different concept of happiness. And I think that a job, if we've seen a lot of studies, if you ask people, would you like to, if you had to pick a job where you had to talk to people about their problems or a job where you spent the week putting together and taking apart a machine, which would you prefer? And far more women than men prefer the talking about feelings, and far more men want to take apart the machine. Many exceptions. We're talking about, the average. So to me, it's just they're doing what they want. And I think I kept trying to find words to describe the kind of feminism I liked. And I said, well, preference feminism. We want a society where people can pursue what they prefer, what they want. And I think we're not perfect, but I think we're pretty good in the United States, and certainly for young women. I think that's why they have, if you look at any esoteric major, who's majoring in I don't know, uh, Welsh poetry or something, it's mostly women, um, because men still have a sense they're probably going to have to do something practical, and so they aren't as likely to be majoring that. But I don't understand why we've taken that one model of success, basically the male model,
Right.
and assumed that women want that.
Well, that seems to be the great, deep, self-invalidating irony of the ideology, is that for women to be awesome and successful, they have to look exactly like the patriarchal males that we hated. It's like, well, if you didn't like these patriarchal males, why would you want to be them in this new order of things? It's just like, let's just flip roles and we get to be the oppressors now, and we get to be workaholics that drive ourselves into the ground. Like, let's just remake Mad Men, only Don Draper is going to be Peggy. And
Right. Or even I thought the Barbie movie, which I sort of liked in the beginning, but then I did you see it?
I did.
Uh, I thought it was a lost opportunity in a way because, first it was Barbie Land and then it was going to be the Kendom or whatever. And then the Barbies got it back. Why can't I thought they would come together, because I think that should be the next chapter of feminism, is men and women coming together with, mutual concern and respect. And we have a movement to liberate human beings, to make life better for men and women.
Well,
boys and girls.
there was a certain, by today's standards, radical transgressiveness of the Barbie movie's ending, right? Because the very end of Barbie is she decides I want to be a real woman, and the way that we see that plays out is that she gets to go to the gynecologist. So
Right.
so at least, for all of Barbie's feminist politics, there was still a notion that a woman has a vagina, which was like,
Not only that, I thought that Ken sort of stole the show. And there was a lot of attention to to problems of men. It was sort of sad the way he was portrayed. And I thought that what must have happened is there were a lot of uh, cooks that went into that stew. So there was a little bit of everything.
the director, Greta Gerwig, I really like.
Yeah.
I thought there's so much, and there's a lot of ink's been spilled over the Barbie movie, but
Yeah.
to move it, but it is an interesting snapshot. So one of the things that seems to be a result of all of this, of the education system failing boys and just being downright hostile to boys, combined with the whole superstructure of education and culture being so us versus them with the genders, is, as you've said, it's becoming very hard for people. It's becoming harder than it used to be, even with all these swiping apps, to actually find a mate, which is what all of us, most of us want to find a mate that can be a partner in life together and
Right.
build a life in friendship and love. That is what I think just about every human being wants. We're genetically hardwired to do it because it's the only way we can procreate and keep the species going. And yet the divergence here is multifold, right? Because on one level, I believe it's still very much the case that women want to marry an equally educated and ideally even more successful man. So when it's a 60-40 split on education and job opportunities, there's a real asynchronous problem there. The other thing that seems to be happening is politically, there's polling and things that are indicating, even in Gen Z, that the boys are starting to break way more right and the girls way more left. And so there's a political divide, and that's happening at a time when politics is increasingly becoming the litmus test for whether I even want to talk to you. So it's if you go, I know people who've gone on a date and the entire conversation came to an end when the political question came up. It was like, well, this isn't going to work. Like, you voted for the guy I hate, therefore you're evil. I don't want to talk to you anymore. So how do you understand those dynamics and what's going on there?
Well, I just think there are so many fault lines in Americans, and we're divided. And if we can find ways that unite us, and I still believe it must be the case that most young people, see one another as humans, and they're not vilifying and hating and so forth. There's a lot of that, but I think there's still hope that we can come back from
It's still a vocal
all that
minority.
excess. But I think we could get a lot of help if the creative community, for example, who are doing the theater and the songs and the films and so forth, if it could show young people human flourishing and show that that is sometimes conventional, and there could be a happy love story. It doesn't have to be always reversed. It doesn't have to be the women are the hero and men are, being saved, or it could be the reverse sometime. They don't, to overcome the past stereotypes. We don't want to replace them with a whole new set. That shouldn't be the goal of the movement. And I think with men and women, the goal isn't, to get ahead of men. It's to be friends with men and be on the each one with one another on each other's team. But now it's all. I think it's a fashion. It's lasted longer than I ever expected, but I think these social movements take time. And this may be an era of what the great writer Tom Wolfe called the great relearning. Tom Wolfe, the novelist, said he had a story that he wrote in, I think it was in Esquire originally, about he went and studied a group of hippies living in living in San Francisco, and these hippies were extreme. They had uh, rejected everything about Western society, including hygiene. And by the way, I was a flower child. We didn't all reject hygiene, but this group of hippies rejected hygiene. And they didn't, they didn't take baths and they didn't cut their hair. They were earthy, natural. And as Tom Wolfe reports, the free clinic in Berkeley, California, was seeing diseases that were so old they hadn't even acquired Latin names. I mean, they were just the itch and the rot and the, I don't know, these diseases. And the hippies, one by one, had to rediscover modern hygiene. And he calls it the great relearning. And I'm thinking that we are sort of a society, we've done everything we can to smash, the constants of, civilization and every assumption of civilization and about human nature. So we've done it. We'll probably continue to. But at a certain point, it's enough. And we're going to have to start relearning the fundamental principles of civilization and the age-old truths repeated in every major religious text or philosophical text about, the constants, about under what conditions do human beings flourish, and how do we make a successful life in this world. The great relearning. It's got to happen, because I think we've gone on so many binges that it's time for some repose and reflection.
I think those dirty hippies were in good company with Karl Marx, who bathed so little that he developed boils all over his body, and his doctors, as I understand it, were like, "I don't understand, Karl. Like, nobody else has these boils. There's not something going around. Maybe you should rub a bar of soap across your body from time to time."
He was something, wasn't he? Quite a kid.
Yeah,
oh boy.
It is. Why do you think you mentioned this somewhat in passing, and the notion that sort of this us versus them intersectional feminism is Marxist in its orientation? And I think, number one, what does that actually mean to you? And we did have a lot of experiments with communism that went really badly in the 20th century. So I am struck by how this sort of also ran dirty loaf guy living off Engels still in 2024 is coming out of the mouths of Columbia students in the streets. I mean,
well, this I think is part of another failure in our educational system, is just not teaching history. Because I think anyone who would do a careful reading of how Marxist-Leninist doctrines played out in every place they've been tried would know that it was just a recipe for mass death and suffering, cruelty, and death. There's never been a society where it's led to anything like, the utopia it promised. Quite the opposite. But it's as if that a whole generation of kids they weren't around for even the Cold War, and they don't know. And it's not in the books, the history books, and increasingly, especially at our most elite schools, including the prep schools, the high schools, the elite high schools. Someone has to do like I said, my friend Sandra Stotsky did a content analysis of social study books. She did that. That was 25 years. Someone should do it today. What are students reading in the classroom? What history are they learning? What are they learning about economics? What are they learning about biology? I think it would be eye-opening, and I think we should have more discussion. Again, it shouldn't be in the hands of a small coterie of like-minded people carried away with a strange theory based on dubious statistics. That's how I characterize gender feminism, but I think there are a lot of other isms that are the same. And so I think we're going to have to reform the schools, and there's no way around looking at schools of education and the content of what children are learning. And it's doable. I mean, maybe you can't do it everywhere at once, but you could start. There are some states that are more carried away with these crazy theories than others. Because education is more local, but it can be done, and I hope we do it soon because it's a serious problem. It's a national security problem. I worry even if if there were ever a real threat to this country, like maybe we faced in World War II, when the country rallied. If something like that happened, will the country rally? I mean, I hope so. I assume so, but I don't know. There are a lot of people who seem to think that we are always the bad guys, and they've read some distorted history that took, every opportunity to view the United States as some kind of hellscape.
I have one more big question before we kind of come, start to. I release you back to the world. Maybe the strangest thing that's happened in recent years is this alignment between these sort of, I don't know what you call these people, but the sort of woke ideology people and Islam. So
I know.
I don't. Again, the young, passionate, self-described radical feminists who are taking to the streets of our major universities to defend Islamic fundamentalists. How do you have any way to help me understand how you can get from that to that? Because it is baffling to me.
I will tell you, I thought I couldn't be surprised by the just crazy things that came out of the colleges in recent years. This surprised me. However, it does make sense at a certain level. I think the students on the campus, and I'm talking about the extremists, or with Hamas flags and
Yeah.
chanting uh, from the river to the sea, all of that. I don't think they know very much about the history of in the Middle East and the struggle between the Israelis and the Palestinians. I think they wouldn't pass a test. But I think they, because of the theory, they learned about oppression and these dominance hierarchies. And so you have, whiteness is bad and people of color oppressed. So they look at the Palestinian-Israeli situation as just replicating what they've learned about the struggle for racial justice in this country. Well, that's already a huge mistake at so many levels. I mean, the Israelis it's just to say that it's a white country is absurd when half the population or more come from Muslim countries and we're thrown out of those countries.
Right.
It's complicated. I won't get into that
Yeah.
struggle, but what do they know about it? They've taken this it's so depressing, this model, this intersectional analysis, this popularization of intersectionality that they use, where they just see everything as dominance hierarchies, and you just have to side with the most oppressed. And somehow, it's as if these Hamas fighters are, avatars of oppression, of being oppressed, rather than just being like fanatical fascists, or murderers. They are seen as victims of colonialism and all these things that they've studied in their very limited exposure to history. So I think that the excitement is based on a cartoon understanding of history and geopolitics.
But
the passions are there. The
part that is harder for me to get my head around, being confused and ignorant about Israel versus Palestine is one thing. But the the particular flavor of Islam that they are allying with is, and this is not true of all is all of Islam or Islamic people or Muslims everywhere, but what they're aligning themselves with are like gender apartheid lunatics who want women in burqas,
Right.
and it's where it's legal for your husband to kill you. Like, so is it?
And where gay people are executed. No, there's no tolerance for difference in gender expression, that sort of thing. And it's empowered by Iran, which is contemporary Iran is like 1984 for women. I mean, it's just a nightmare for so many women who are enforced veiling, and they are policed in the street. They have these virtue enforcers, and if you're seen with a little bit of nail polish or, heaven forbid, too much of an ankle showing, you can be carted off in a car and taken away and beaten. And if you protest, women writers and brilliant women. I mean, they have feminists there, and they're um, the most embattled women and the bravest, most courageous women I have ever known. I don't know. I know some who've come here, but the ones there, that is courage. And then why don't we have a women's movement that's offering, help, reaching out and doing what we can, making a big case about every time one of them gets arrested or, and horrible things happen after they're arrested? Why don't we have a national movement in the West of feminists who reaching out to their sisters in parts of the world where they don't have rights, such as Iran? And instead, it led to the opposite. It led to identifying with the oppressor. Now that should be a sign, and that's, maybe I'll end with this, but I think that this is such a perverse development that you end up, a lot of people thought, oh, the radical kids on the campus, they just have so much kindness and they want the world to be a better place. Maybe they're a little naive, but it's all about This isn't about kindness. I haven't seen a lot of kindness in these demonstrations. I mean, this is suddenly, it's morphed into something very angry and vengeful. And I think a lot of people's eyes may have been open, a lot of parents, and that something may be amiss. So it may be, we didn't want anything like this, but this may be a point where there'll be a relearning.
I ask every guest of the show the same question, but I'm gonna bundle one in here, so it'll be 2 for 1. So I call this show "Dad Saves America," because I believe that our role as men in fatherhood is really the most heroic thing we can do for ourselves, for the family, and for the country. I don't think every man needs to be a father, but just about every man should. And
Yeah.
and so I'd like to ask you how you see your role in the American story, and as part of that, where you see causes for optimism, since we've sort of come to a point in our conversation that's quite dark. But I do think I refuse to give up hope in this country, and I know you do. I know you share that feeling. So I'll let you have the last word.
Yes, I think that I'm not going to give up. And anybody who's in the past who's given up on America, I mean, they've been wrong, and I think that we would be wrong to do so. This society has a way. I think it was the historian Paul Johnson said that Americans are great problem solvers. The world's great. They create horrible problems for themselves. They go almost to the abyss, but they're problem solvers, and they get by it. And I think we still have that. And I'm seeing things right now in Silicon Valley. There's a lot of money, a lot of power, and there's been an awakening, I think, that something is amiss. You're seeing people beginning to worry about what's happening in our schools. You're beginning to see a lot of parents sending their kids, competing and trying all they can to send it to the elite schools, and now wondering what's going on there. And do I really want this for my child? So suddenly we've become more aware, and I think more and more people should find a way to be part of the effort. I admire what you're doing. I admire, Barry Weiss and the Free Press and the whole efforts to have alternative source of information, journalism that's willing to tell these stories of what's happening in the culture. So that's always how Americans have solved the problems. They start an organization or a group of people, small group of people get together, and a small group of determined people can change the world. So I'm seeing lots of groups like that. It's happening, and I'd like to see more of it. It's not going to be easy, but I'm not going to bet against America. It's always come through, and I still think the fundamentals are intact, and we can overcome this, but it's a challenge.
Christina, thank you for being on Dad Saves America. I really appreciate you taking the time with me today.
Thank you.